Hi, it's Mark Bernard. I'm here with the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity, and I've been invited to the Infonex Professional Development Training Day, and I want to thank Infonex for the opportunity to come in and to speak. Today, I will be talking about cybersecurity control frameworks and how they're integrating or extending the traditional internal control and financial reporting control set. On the agenda today, we're going to touch on a few different points. One is governance and risk management of cybersecurity. Another one is on what I call the crazy eights, so the top 8 threats and the top 8 vulnerabilities. We'll also talk about compliance risks associated with cybersecurity regulations and the integration between internal control frameworks and cybersecurity. And we're also going to talk about the relationship between operational risk and enterprise risks. That's a shifting paradigm, as you can imagine, as cybersecurity continues to evolve and mature. Traditional control frameworks are also needing to change to keep up. First, let's talk about the organization's exposure to risks. It's no longer regional or national. This is the cybersecurity risk universe, okay? And it's based on the COSO Enterprise Risk Management Framework. So you can see here we have the top 5 risks for the enterprise. We have financial risk, hazard risk, strategic risk, compliance risk, and operational risk. And within each of these areas, we have, these little bubbles here. So these represent 6 different assets, and we're going to talk more about the 6 assets that are used to deliver products and services. So we have people, information, software, hardware, telecommunications, and facilities. And the reason why we differentiate between hardware and telecommunication is because it's a privacy-related issue, and data is transitory when it comes to infrastructure and telecommunications devices, whereas servers or laptops or tablets or smartphones, data can be stored, archived, and processed on those devices. So they're a little bit different. Each has its own unique type of vulnerabilities because of those facts. We also have a lot of subcontractors providing services to financial processes within the organization to help manage the hazard risks and also strategic risks, and in addition to compliance risks and operational risks. You can see here on the backbone we have a product or service. Each of these risks are attached to that product or service that we're trying to deliver. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. What has changed? Well, back in the 1970s, 80s, we basically had, companies that had money and could invest would have servers and have data centers, right? There's still a few companies today that have private data centers, but that's really changing. It's really moving more and more toward a cloud every year. And that's the problem, right? Or the challenge. It's not really a problem, but it's a challenge because now we have to adapt our way of thinking around how we used to control, for instance, financial information on a server that's set in our office with our physical security around it to a cloud where the data center is multiple data centers, multiple instances of our data on those servers being constantly updated and harmonized and synced across many different continents and countries. So some of them are in Europe, some of them are in Africa, some of them are in Asia, some of them are in South America, some of them are in Australia, for instance. So they're all over the place. So cloud computing really has changed what it is that we're looking at now, and the level of risk and the level of potential exposure. Now, if we look at the threats today, you can see that there are multiple threats, and this is something that we got from the Checkpoint people who are monitoring. They do a fabulous job on firewalls, and they're constantly monitoring threats and types of attacks. You can see every day this counter gets reset. So on this day, there were 16 million attacks around the globe, and you can see them going back and forth. Some of the top countries being attacked are Mongolia, Nepal, Indonesia, Georgia, Bolivia. And you can see that's over on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, you can see the scrolling list that tells the type of attack. So they're all color-coded. So you can see there are some Trojans going on. There are some bots going on, some botnets. There's a number of different malwares being targeted and trying to be pushed onto other people's servers. There's some remote control threats going on. So there's a lot of threats constantly happen, and you can see how these countries are attacking each other while we're all sitting here doing our jobs. Nobody notices this. All right. So what has changed? Well, the total number of breaches is going up, and there's a number of, I guess, associated reasons why that is going up. Obviously, threats and their attack techniques are getting more sophisticated, more refined. They're having more time to develop these attack methods and strategies. Also, we're getting better at monitoring. So a lot of times attacks were going on and they were completely undetected, which is kind of scary. But you can see that constantly since 2006 up to 2020 or 2018, the number of breaches is going up and up. So as a lot of security professionals say, it's not a matter of if you're going to be breached anymore. It's a matter of when, and you need to have a response for that. Hence, some countries are taking a very proactive approach on that. So the U.S. government has created the Nist cybersecurity framework, for instance. The cost of data breaches is also going up. In the United States, it's $8.19 million now. In the Middle East, it's $5.97 million. Germany, 4.78, and Canada, 4.44. So you can see that a lot of countries are paying heavily for the breaches. I think the United States is probably the most targeted, and perhaps the Middle East and Germany, and then Canada. And that's why we're seeing the cost of it. Also, there's a lot of ransomware attacks going on. So the cost of a breach, sometimes it's not immediately associated with the data that they stole, but it's more or less they've encrypted the entire database, and you can't get access, the company can't get access to their operational data or the customer data, which is terrible. And if you're a hospital, it's even worse because you need access to patient records in order to make decisions about patients. What has changed? Okay, the average total cost of data breach by industry. So you can see the health sector is being targeted, financial second, energy is third, industrial is fourth, and you can see pharmaceutical is fifth, and technology and education and so on and so forth. So you can see the cost of those breaches are $6.45 million for health, financial 5.86, energy 5.60. So there's a lot of unplanned expenses. So if you have cybersecurity insurance, some of this will be covered under cybersecurity insurance, but the cybersecurity insurance industry is just beginning to build. So they don't really have the funds, I guess, to handle like major breaches. So it's possible that you could buy cybersecurity insurance and still not be fully covered. So you need to do some risk mitigation activity. Most Canadian business would close if a breach occurred because the cost of a breach is so high. And if it's $5 or $6 million, what are you going to do if you don't have the liquidity or you don't have the insurance to cover that? You're going to be in trouble. You can see here on this chart, it shows the economies of the world. China is growing, but the U.S. is still leading with 19.3 trillion. Canada is down here. It's 1.6 trillion, so it's very small compared to the others. But so that means that, of course, every breach that impacts our economy is costly. And of course, the really big breaches that hurt us are not so much the loss of financial records, that's more of a reputational issue, but it's the loss of intellectual property, because intellectual property is the backbone of innovation, and innovation is what actually builds these economies. So these economies are built on, how many new ideas, how many creative ways to solve solutions that they have that's makes them rich, that makes people buy their services in their country. And without that innovation and the intellectual property, it kind of levels the playing field. So we were going to talk about assets. I mentioned assets before. So the first asset that we have, of course, is data or information. And we have that all over our organization in many different databases. We have financial data, we have human resource data, we have customer data, we have lots of different types of data. The second asset that we have is people. So people are required. They're very important in order to deliver our services because they bring skills, they bring experience, they help with the innovation process. They do a lot of things. Humans are so important to delivering our services, obviously, and you all know that. And they need data to do their job. And they also need software to manage the data. So to import data, to maintain data, to generate business intelligence, to generate services for other organizations, they need the software. So that's three assets. So data or information, people, software. The next one is hardware. So we have hardware everywhere. Again, we have racks, we have servers, some are in the cloud, some are on our facilities. We also have desktop computers, and we have laptops and tablets and smartphones. So we have a lot of different types of hardware. And in the infrastructure, of course, we have very specialized hardware and software. We have firewalls, and we have routers and switches and load balancers, and might have intrusion prevention systems. There's a lot of information. Switches. A lot of hardware that we have that's stored and used in our infrastructure, and it would also be used in the infrastructure in the cloud as well. So that's four assets. And telecom is a big one. So telecom helps us to create the secure zones around our information, around our systems. It helps us to separate different departments so we can isolate like finance from other groups and give them another layer of protection, because defense in depth, of course, is a big strategy in the cybersecurity world. In order to build layer after layer after layer, I can tell you from my experience working on the red team with IBM for 2 years that the number of layers you have definitely increases your chances of being successful at protecting the information that you're the custodian of, or that might be part of your organization's business. So every layer helps. You can see here that there's many different layers. Okay, so there's a general layer around the IT services, and then there's the layer around the data center, and then there's even a layer within the data center around the security information event management system. And then we have another part of the telecom, of course, are these routers and switches, and we have firewalls, of course, and there's load balancers in there somewhere. And these little red things that you see here, these are taps, and these taps inspect packets as they flow across to see if there's any threats to the data or to the organization. Obviously, we want to tap the outbound and the inbound ingress or regress of the network in order to see what's coming in and out of the network. But we might also tap inside the network to see what kind of data is flowing between different segments. And then we have external segments within other facilities. So that's telecom. So we have people, information, software, hardware, telecom, and the last one is facilities. So we have physical properties that help separate the networks. So we have our head office has a lot of information. And you can see here we have a solid line around this because this is our second firewall. So all information, the security rule is that 2 firewalls from the internet. So all the sensitive information should be 2 firewalls. So you see these firewalls in here protecting the information. In between here, this is called the DMZ or demilitarized zone. And then, our warehouses might have a private network that's connected to us, as well as our customers. Perhaps when we're working at home, especially during these days as a pandemic is looming, we may also protect information in our home, and we may have a firewall set up if we do, or we might have secure parameters to protect our data and our information that we're working on. And we use VPN tunnels into the office. And then, of course, our customers, they may also have firewalls. They probably do. They probably have the same kind of infrastructure that we have. Okay? And here's some of the names for the different departments. So sales is separated from finance. The on-site privileged users are separated from others. We have the security team who is monitoring the activity on the network to detect any anomalies or events that are happening and hopefully prevent an incident from occurring. And those are our assets. So again, just to recap, information, people, software, hardware, telecom, and facilities. Governance and the risk management of cybersecurity. Okay, so first of all, we have a governance committee. The governance committee in the perfect world is made up of people, senior executives, who are responsible for specific portfolios. So the president or the chief executive officer has an executive team, and he's allocated the responsibility for different divisions or different parts of the organization to a number of high-level, very highly intelligent, experienced executives who manage those portfolios like they manage their own business. So they do a good job and take care of that. So the governance committee should be made up of these people. And why? Because they own the risk for their different areas. They have responsibility for resources and capital, so they can mitigate risk if they see it and they believe that it's a real threat to them. So we have a governance committee. The governance committee should know what our legal obligations are as an organization. They should know what the statutes and regulations are that we have to comply with. Example of a regulation might be PCI, for instance. Example of statutes might be the Incorporation Act, for instance, why we're incorporated. It could also be things like FOIPA or GDPR. Internal facing contracts are from the licensed products that we use. So if we use Oracle or Microsoft or SAP, we have a commitment to those organizations to protect their intellectual property. And this is where we would register those agreements. And then we have the external facing contracts. And those are the contracts with our customers that we provide service or products to. So those are the four classifications of legal obligations. And the executive team is definitely very familiar with these, and they follow them and track them. It's not all that they do, but it's a big concern. If you remember from the ERM, the Enterprise Risk Management Risk Universe, compliance risk was one of the main bubbles, one of the 5 bubbles. So compliance risk is very important. Compliance with legal obligations obviously is important. These people make decisions. So the Chief Information Security Officer, or whoever the leader is, the Information Security Officer, brings activities. I guess they do risk assessments. They bring external audits, internal audit reports. They bring risk assessments. They bring privacy impact assessments to the governance committee to make decisions about how we're going to treat the risk, or if we're going to ignore it, what is it that we're going to do. They have to make the final decision. Again, they own the risk, so they need to make the decision. And then based on those decisions, we may create new policies. Policies shouldn't be created just for the sake of having a policy. A policy should be actually created based on some perceived risk to the organization. And a policy is a very high level control statement that says, when you're conducting this type of business, you need to, be aware of this. Or if you are handling sensitive information, you need to be aware of this. So it gives them instructions. It's not a procedure. It's not a standard, but it's just a statement, the policy. Okay. And then we have job descriptions. So job descriptions get defined for employees that work in these different portfolios. They have different roles and responsibilities, which means that they need access to different types of network services, different types of data within the organization. So this is a very important part of the process in order to have an effective identity and access management system or access control system. It needs to be based on job descriptions. And job descriptions need to be refined to the point where if someone looks at it, they know what type of access that a person needs. And we should avoid the old traditional method of saying, oh, Bill does the same kind of work that Sally does, so just copy Sally's profile and make a new profile and call it Bill. Because a lot of access control problems happen that way, and they get inherited, right, from one person to another. So it's a bit of an issue. Anyway, we're talking about governance here. So job descriptions, policies are an important part of governance, as well as understanding legal obligations. Also, there's something called a statement of applicability, and we use this in the ISO 27000 world. And the statement of applicability is a list of agreed to controls. So as we do risk assessments and we make recommendations on controls for the internal organization, we build a registry, and the registry is approved controls. And this is very important because a lot of organizations don't do these things. They don't have legal registries, and they don't have statements of applicability, and they should do this because it's fundamentally important to the success of the cybersecurity program. And why? Because what will happen is you will have auditors, internal auditors and external auditors providing some of their expertise by reviewing your control frameworks and providing advice. A lot of times they'll make recommendations for controls that you already have in place. So it's wise for the governance committee to ask the CISO or whoever it is that's leading the security program for the organization or the cybersecurity program to review the controls as part of the risk assessment process to see if there's an opportunity to improve on the existing control framework, because the organization has already invested in controls. We don't want to keep adding controls. More controls does not equal more security. Actually, more controls can equal more confusion. That's what it can equal. And it can equal a lot of extra costs, financial costs for these auditors and for these recommendations, because every time you implement a control, that control has to be maintained, it has to be monitored, it has to be tracked. So the more controls you have does not mean that you're going to be more successful at defeating a potential threat or mitigating some exposure to a vulnerability. Okay, so a statement of applicability is a very wise thing to have. If you're an ISO 27000 certified organization, you already know about this. If you're not, then you should take it into consideration. So that's governance and risk management. Let's talk about the crazy eights now. All right, so we have evaluated all the threats. We do threat modeling once a year for our risk assessment process. And we have evaluated a number of top threats. So, and it's based on some criteria that we're going to talk about in a minute. So there's a 5-scale risk assessment process that we're going to talk about, or I guess risk rating scale that's been integrated with incident management, service management, service desk, and also risk management. So it's a very interesting approach to trying to harmonize our risk decision making within the organization. So we'll talk about that too a little bit later. So here are the top 8 threats. So government spies. Why? Mostly because government spies have unlimited access. They have unlimited skills, access to skills, to capabilities, to computing infrastructure, to anything that they need in order to infiltrate another government and steal information from them, including like patents that we talked about and any type of innovation material that might make their government more profitable and more lucrative and build up their GDPR, the gross domestic product, the GDP. Organized crime. So they're motivated for a different reason. So government spies might be motivated for, national security or innovation issues, opportunities. Organized crime is looking for money, of course. So there's lots of opportunity to make money. A lot of the, top 180 different types of fraud that can be committed traditionally are now being reinvented on the internet, and organized crime is taking advantage of it. And of course, the most popular one right now is ransomware. Then you have competitors. Competitors could hire hackers to steal your customer lists or strategic plans so that they could outmaneuver you in the field. So that's got to be a concern. It's not a top risk, but it's next in line. So it's you can see here, this is extreme, so this is critical. So if a competitor steals your client list or strategic plans, they could outmaneuver you and impact your strategic future, your strategic risks. So if you remember, again, back on the enterprise risk management framework, there are strategic risks, one of the top 5, and this could have an impact on that. And then there's contractors. So we have lots of contractors providing different services. Certainly the Nist cybersecurity framework has zoomed in on supply chain. It talks about supply chain a lot. Supply chain is not something that's new. After the unfortunate events of 9/11, President Bush initiated a project called Project Vigilance. It's still going. You don't hear a lot about it, but it was designed to review the food chain for Americans in order to find out where we get our ingredients from, where we get our food from, where is it shipped from, and to look for any potential for biological weapons of mass destruction. So contractors are important to review, suppliers, vendors. We've got to pay close attention to those people because they are close to us. They are helping us provide services. They do have more access than other people do normally. And then there are terrorists. And terrorists are obviously out to disrupt and to change things and to put fear in people. And they can impact our strategic plans as well, which could also trickle down and impact our financial plans and risks. And obviously, hazard risks to humans, it could impact as well. So there's a trickle down effect from that area. If we're trying to expand a business in a certain region within the world, and that region is destabilized for whatever reason, and we have acts of terrorism happening, it could frighten people away from doing work for us. And then we have the malicious. So the malicious are not interested in money. They're interested in maybe fame, but mostly they have a cause, and they want to make their cause known. So they'll do whatever it is to disrupt an organization, especially if you're on their list of targets. If you're an environmentalist and you're concerned about the environment, you might have an environmental hacker trying to hack into oil companies and sabotage them, or into energy lines. There's a lot of that going on. We've been getting better and better at preventing it, but it still happens. And then there's a third party, and this is similar to a contractor. The contractor is kind of an expert who comes into your office, where the third party might be someone who provides some kind of materials or parts to your organization. So they're both kind of part of the supply chain. So we'll talk about that more too. And then there's, of course, employees. So we always want to keep employees happy, but there is a possibility that an employee might become disgruntled. And if they do, they might want to hurt the company in some way. It's a small percentage of people, based on my experience monitoring networks and systems, working on the red teams. It's a very small percentage, maybe 3% of employees are testing security, trying to get into different areas of the organization. Some of it is just curiosity, which can be dangerous for them, and might warrant a visit from the security people. But some of it is accidental, and some of it is deliberate for sure. Okay, and then we have the top 8 vulnerabilities. And the top 8 vulnerabilities are software related, telecom, configuration hardware, nanotech, robots, social engineering, and the food chain. And software and telecom and hardware all kind of fall under the same issue. You can see they're all code blue here. So they're all like extreme risks, right? So you remember the Equifax breach cost $750 million so far for Equifax to try and repair that one. That was because of one patch, and it was actually a known patch that a lot of people had already implemented, but for some reason it got delayed or stalled at Equifax, and someone, an external threat agent, knew about it, scanned their environment, and had exploit code and executed it and got into their system and stole 147 million records. And Equifax keeps a lot of sensitive information on people. So very alarming, very disturbing about what happened there. They should be, the highest level of security for that organization. But anyway, that was a vulnerability that got exposed. There's software that has vulnerabilities. Telecom has vulnerabilities. These things need to be monitored and patched. You need to have something like a configuration management database, so you keep your assets in an inventory and you check your assets on a regular basis to make sure they're being patched. Check on the maintenance cycles. Check on the cradle to grave relationship to find out when they're about to be retired, and bringing on new equipment and making sure that's patched. Configuration changes also create a lot of problems. Misconfiguration, more likely, is what creates the problem. The actual configuration is good, but misconfiguration can leave holes in security so that people could exploit your systems. Nanotech is something that's totally off the radar right now, but the U.S. government is extremely interested in nanotech because it's undetectable. You can breathe in nanobots and you don't even know it, and you can carry nanobots across any border and it can't be detected on you at all, because it's 1/1,000,000th of a millimeter. It's smaller than a skin cell or a blood cell. It's so small. And if you think about it, the stucknecks, if you're familiar with the stuckneck worm that almost created a meltdown of a reactor, that virus was about 128K in size. But if you shrunk that down to a nanotech size, it would be completely undetectable, right? So even if you were looking for that's .next again, and it's registered in your antivirus system, you probably wouldn't see it if it was nanotech. It could pass right through the firewall. No problems. And then, of course, there's the robots. The dawn of robots is taking over, and we have to be, aware that robots run on hardware and software, and that they have vulnerabilities, and they need to be patched and fixed. But these things are more mobile. They have more access. They do more functions, human functions, for us. So we have to be more cognizant of the exposure or the threat to robots caused by robots. And then there's social engineering. Social engineering is done all the time. Social engineering is done for good and for bad. So it's all about getting people to do something that normally they wouldn't do, or give up information that they normally wouldn't give up, by creating a sort of a scenario where they fall into a trap. The latest, evolution of social engineering are phishing scams. And phishing scams are often used in the initial stages of a ransomware attack. So a phishing scam, if you're using an email system that has HTML based behind the link, and someone scans over the link or clicks on the link, they may actually inadvertently download the Trojan, the ransomware Trojan, onto their system, and that begins the process. And then there's the food chain. So the food chain is something, like I mentioned, that President Bush had started a project on, Project Vigilance. And it's something that we have to be aware of, because certainly there are things that could be ingredients that go into food, and there's food that we get from other countries that could contain some kind of biological weapon. So we have to be aware of that. That's the top 8. So let's talk about how we evaluate the top 8 a little bit. So you can see here we have likelihood and exposure. And then we have these major categories broken down into knowledge. So likelihood is broken down into knowledge, skill, resource. So knowledge is, how much does a threat agent, and threats are always human. You remember on this scale here, on this chart, you see there are no threats here that are not human. And this is another misnomer. A lot of people believe that malware is a threat, but malware is not actually a threat. Malware is a tool that someone is using to target your organization. So malware is not the threat. Malware is just a tool, but the threat is actually a human. Okay, back to this. Okay, so how much knowledge does that threat agent need to have about your organization in order to be able to exploit it? The more knowledge someone has, such as a disgruntled employee, the more dangerous the threat is. How much skill do they need? Again, the more knowledge that they have about your infrastructure, about your layout of your telecommunications, where your data is stored, served, who the people are that are involved, can sign checks, for instance. The more knowledge they have and the more skill they have to infiltrate, the more dangerous they are. And of course, resources. So if it's one resource that can be successful at executing a threat against an organization, it's going to be harder to stop than if it was a group of people, because the more people you get involved, the more coordination is required. And that kind of stuff gets noticed by law enforcement on the internet. So these are things. So they can actually be, this is the actual score for these in this case. 2 for knowledge, 2 for skill, 3 for resource. The possible score is a weighting score that you can add based on your organization. I made this simple, so it's based on a 100% scale. So we made it, 4. You can make it a different number if you think that one of these has more of, a weighting in on the threat modeling exercise. And then we look at exposure, and exposure is broken down into capability and motive. So capability is how capable that person is. So we talked about knowledge, skill, resource before. Now we're talking about capability. So are they actually able to create this? Are they in a situation where they can get access to the knowledge, skill, and resources that they need to do that? If they are highly capable, then that increases the score. And of course, if they're motivated. So we try not to motivate threat agents, but some organizations can't help but motivate a threat agent, and that creates a bigger problem, a bigger exposure for them. And you can see the scores are calculated down here, 14, possible of 20, which gives you a 73% rating. And that's how these were evaluated, these threats here. You can see these were evaluated based on that threat modeling technique. Vulnerabilities are very similar, except they have different categories. So vulnerabilities, we look at things like, for instance, consequence and impact. And we break down consequence by what is the loss of confidentiality going to do to the organization? How about the loss of integrity, loss of availability? And again, it's based on a 100% scale. So we made this simple. We put a 4 in there, and then we did some weighting. So the consequence in this case is 2. So that's sort of moderate. 4 is high, and 4 is high. So loss of integrity and availability is a big issue. And then we look at impact. So the severity and the exposure. So if we look at the severity, what would the loss of confidentiality, integrity, availability do to the organization? Could this vulnerability possibly end our organization? Because we mentioned before, the cost of breaches are going up. Some companies, especially mom and pop companies, could never afford cybersecurity insurance. They could never afford to pay for a $6 million breach, right? So they would go Chapter 11, and then that would be it for their company. And then exposure. So how exposed are we? So this is the whole purpose behind doing risk assessments, is to be able to evaluate the exposure, looking, and we're going to talk about this, about, you know, the vulnerabilities within assets, the impact of that asset, and the ability of a threat agent to be able to exploit that vulnerability. So this is exposure rating is very sensitive. It's very important to understand. And you can see here how they've scored. So a lot of cases it's 90. So that's very high. If we looked at the risk rating scale, that falls under critical. So this vulnerability needs to be treated immediately. All right. Let's move along. So the Nist cybersecurity framework was created in 2014 after Executive Order 21, I think it was, by President Obama. And it contains 108 control points. And what they've done here is they've taken basically an incident handling practice and they've kind of modified it a bit. So detect incidents, respond to incidents, and recover from incidents are listed here. But before you do that, you need to identify. So identify is about the governance, about the risk management, and they snuck in supply chain here because I don't think they knew where to put this, but I don't think it belongs here. Anyway, it's here for now. This is version 1.1. It might be changed in 1.2. A protect is about actually applying security controls within the infrastructure. So you can see here, there's 29 points that are focused on the governance and the risk management. There's 39 points on actually implementing controls. And then detecting 18 control points, responding to those 16, and recovery 6. So this is a good framework. It's been adopted by the U.S. government, of course, created by the Nist organization at the request of the Commerce organization within the government. And now it's been adopted by Canada too. So Canada, at the federal level at least, some provincial organizations are also looking at adopting this. It's not bad. It requires a high level of maturity to get implemented. It's similar to PCI. There's a short time frame, 1 to 2 years. They expect you to be up and have this running to a very high level of maturity. One of the best standards that I've seen, though, for cybersecurity actually comes from New York, the Big Apple. So the NYCRR 500 compliance has a lot of good things in it. One of those things, obviously, is having a chief information security officer attend board meetings. So that is really important. It's changing the focus of many organizations. So now cybersecurity is going to be a top level issue to be discussed. Within the Nist cybersecurity framework, I was mentioning that the focus is on risk management, the integration of risk management, risk-based thinking within your organization. You can see here are the main processes, the tiers, the descriptions of those tiers. So we have risk management processes are implemented and matured. We have integrated risk management program. So the integration of risk management means that all the existing processes that you do as an organization need to now look at the risk associated with that process. And then we have external participation. And this means that any sort of threat intelligence that we get, we want to share with other other organizations rather, and we want to also gather their threat intelligence so that we all protect the critical infrastructure to a higher level, a higher degree of safety. The tier levels are partial. So this looks like a capability maturity model, but it's not quite. It's a little bit different. So partial, risk-informed, repeatable, adaptive. And you can see this is called a star chart, by the way. So we put our star on where we are today. So we're at partial, but we want to get to repeatable. So that's our goal. In order to get to repeatable, you have to have documentation. You have to have performance criteria, maybe key performance indicators. You review your program regularly. If you have a CISO, you're monitoring this all the time. Of course, you have somebody taking care of this. If you don't, then you're reporting this up to the governance committee on a regular basis. Where are we with the risk management process? How is it being integrated? So this should be the focus. If you're adopting this cybersecurity framework, this is kind of the focus of your project, right? Is how are you moving these along within the organization and the various processes? Now, within an internal control framework, it goes through a number of steps. So there's the control environment, and you're familiar with this if you've done SOC 1, 2, or 3. You've seen this before. Control framework leads to risk management. So you need to manage the risk. You'd think it'd be the other way around, though. You'd think that you would be evaluating risks and then making decisions about control. So this framework has been around for a while. It might need to be updated a bit. Risk management leads to control activities. So we're implementing new controls. We're modifying old controls. We're taking better care of risk. If you have a statement of applicability, you might be looking at the registry of controls that you have in place now and making decisions about whether you need to add a new control or modify one of the existing controls. And then there's information and communication process. So you need to make sure that, your infrastructure and your telecommunications are secure around the financial handling of records. Your general ledger and all the payment systems, the AR, the PR, all that sort of activity that's going on, you need to have control over. And the monitoring. So there's a monitoring step. This could be construed in a couple of different ways. So in the traditional way, it was probably having internal audit do the review and report to the subcommittee from the board of directors on audit. In the more modern sense, in the cybersecurity world, what we're doing is we actually can monitor this as part of the security information event management system. So if we have built controls in our infrastructure or in our cloud, and we're monitoring the controls at our SOC, we can be more proactive about how we address these things. So we go from audit perspective, which is more of a detective monitoring stance, to more of a proactive and preventative method with cybersecurity. So this is a big change for the traditional frameworks of integration and reporting over financial reporting, control over financial reporting. All right. The control environment. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So we look at the control environment. So we look at, I think it's 17 different items. So commitment to integrity. So the integrity of the process, the integrity of the data, independence from management. So we need to have, I mentioned before, there's usually a subcommittee of the board of directors, and usually internal audit reports into that subcommittee. The CISO role can take on a couple different flavors. So if your CISO is operational, then they're making decisions about security every day. And unfortunately, if you're making decisions about security, you're not independent from the management organization. So that's why an internal auditor is valuable, somebody who can review the control framework. However, the CISO could also provide oversight, and maybe they provide opinions and suggestions and recommendations on how cybersecurity should be implemented, how assets should be protected, and maybe they have an auditor who sits in their group who does a review to make sure that people are complying with the legal obligations that I mentioned before, and also and the statement of applicability and the controls that you've agreed to. So in that way, they would be independent, maybe not completely from management, but they are arm's length reach if they're providing oversight versus operational activity. You need to establish roles and responsibilities. We talked about that earlier. You remember that's part of the governance process. Commitment to attract and develop and retain competent individuals. So part of the evaluation of control effectiveness, you should look at, what kind of technology have we implemented? Do we have people who have been trained to manage that that implementation, because if we don't, then maybe we need to create a professional development plan for that person who's been assigned the responsibility. Maybe we need to think about hiring new people. There's a lot of different angles, but we need to have competence. Competence is very important to being effective. Hold individuals accountable. This is a key part of all governance frameworks. So you assign responsibilities, you review the activity, and then if there's good outcomes, of course you recognize that, and if there's bad outcomes, and then you also address that. But employees need to know that they're accountable. So that means there needs to be a delineation, right, between roles and responsibilities. This can be very difficult in a government because a lot of times people make decisions about different parts of the organization that they have no responsibility for. We talked about the legal registry, right? So the Incorporation Act, for instance, says that the chief executive officer and his executive team, actually it's director and above, are all responsible for fiduciary responsibilities for the organization. So they're responsible for making sure that the organization follows the letter of the law and that they're held accountable for that, right? Whereas in the government, that doesn't necessarily happen, right? So sometimes you have people making decisions about areas of risk that they don't really have any accountability for. So if they make a bad decision, it doesn't come back to them. They're never held accountable. And that can be a big problem. Risk management. So risk management is important. And we have controls here listed 6 to 9. So specifying the objectives for risk management. We talked about getting the governance board to approve the risk management policy, the risk management methodology, which includes things like the procedure to conduct risk assessments, risk treatment plan, risk registry, any of those sorts of components that are part of a risk assessment process, setting out the risk ratings, integrating those risk ratings with other parts of the business so that everyone's thinking about risk and managing things along the same line as risk. So those are important. In the policy, we set the risk appetite. So this specifies the objective. Also, we could do this in an annual business plan, a tactical plan for the Chief Information Security Officer or whoever it is that's leading this cybersecurity program. We need to identify risks. I was just talking about the risk assessment process. That happens. That can be documented in the risk management methodology and policy. Consider potential for fraud. So there is always a potential for fraud. I know in my business, during my career, I have found many people doing different kinds of fraud and reported it, and varying results. Sometimes people get fired, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get charged, sometimes they don't. A lot of organizations don't want to talk about it when it's an insider problem, but they don't keep the person around either because there's a responsibility that the organization has. So consider the potential for fraud. When I led the Morgan Stanley cybersecurity program, I had 130 reports, 6 teams. One was insider threat. So obviously we're always monitoring for it. I also had an e-fraud team, and they were also looking for fraud, but it was a different kind of fraud. So it was the customer side of fraud conducted against the bank, whereas the insider team was looking at the insider fraud angle. Identity and access changes. So again, identity and access control system. So this needs to be in place. It needs to be managed properly. It needs to be lined up with the job descriptions so that we know what people need to have access to. And it needs to be reviewed on a regular basis so we don't have old accounts hanging around for a long time. We don't have bad passwords being created. We have, multi-factor authentication. We use biometrics. We use whatever the controls are that are needed to protect the information. And of course, we always look at the value of the information and we say, if the value of the information is $500, for instance, we're not going to invest $1,000 in controls to protect that $500 normally. Normally, we won't go any higher than $500. So whatever the investment is in the control framework, and this ties back to the statement of applicability and the registry, right? There is a balancing, there's an accountability, a financial accountability process that you go through in order to reconcile, your investment in the cybersecurity program versus the risk that needs to be done. So, and access management plays an important role in that. Control activities include developing control activities to mitigate risk. So we talked about the risk management process and how we do that. Develop activities to support achievement of objectives. So we talked about that. So if the objective is to keep the risk down low, or eliminate it or eradicate it, then that's what we do. In the risk rating scale, we've identified the objective for critical and for extreme. So extreme, you have 2 hours to mitigate that risk. Critical, you have 4 hours. But then we have the risk appetite that saws off the critical from the high. So anything 79, score 79 risk rating or below is treated more like scheduled activity. So for instance, high risk items have 10 days to be treated, medium have 30 days, and low risk items still need to be treated, but they have 90 days. So all of these, some of these things can be fit into, windows, maintenance windows that we have, regular maintenance windows, regular maintenance activities, quarterly maintenance activities, because some of the big infrastructure companies that we get services from, for instance, from Oracle, they only send patches out every quarter, so every 90 days. So if we don't have the patches, we can't install them. But we need another 90 days probably to test them and evaluate them and get them in place. Cisco is the same way. They don't deliver them on a regular basis unless they're extreme or critical. Okay, so develop control activities to support achievement of objectives. So the objectives are defined in that risk rating scale. Develop control activities through policies. So the risk management policy can also define what the risk appetite is. So these are all evolutionary steps in what used to be an internal control framework for financial reporting, but is now more cybersecurity flavored. Information and communication. So obtain information to support internal control. So we talked about the Nist framework and about that third column, right? So exchanging threat intelligence information, so sharing your information, and also gathering threat intelligence information from other people, other organizations. So that's an important step in the process. So obtaining information to support your internal control. So this is a very important integration point. Not there before in the past. Okay, this is part of the cybersecurity world. So we have teams like, or sources like the FBI, and we have U.S. CERT. So they provide lots of valuable intelligence around the different threats that are out there. We also have the Canadian Exchange for Threat Intelligence. So we also have them. We have the RCMP. There's many different sources, right, that can provide intelligence to the organization, and you can share intelligence if you are collecting it, if you have a honeypot, or if you are reporting on any type of attacks against your device, you can share that information with other people. Communicate the information and communicate with external partners. So up to the board or the governance committee, who would probably take it to the board or might invite you. If you're in New York, your CISO is already sitting on the board, so they might bring it to the board. Also communicating with external parties, so letting know, your suppliers, your partners that are out there in this critical infrastructure, what's going on, so that you guys can all work together and defend yourselves. So very good. So all of this has changed really in the cybersecurity world. Monitoring. So select, develop, and perform evaluation. So this is really a detective type of activity. It's after the fact. We are becoming more proactive, more online. We have to be, because the threats are evolving. They're more sophisticated. We need to be able to defend ourselves today. If we wait until the next audit report, it may be too late. The damage may have already been done. Evaluate and communicate internal control deficiencies. So again, when we have failures, when we have cybersecurity events that we stop, we report on those, say what a great job we're doing. But also when we have incidents and we have to investigate the incidents and determine what the damage is, we might do a post-impact assessment or a victim impact assessment, the type of deficiencies at that level. Also on the risk assessment process, we're going to talk about the risks that a vulnerability has and the exposure that it has to that threat. So these could be deficiencies, especially if we have existing controls in place today and the existing controls can't address the threat, or maybe they need to be modified, as I mentioned before, because you have the statement of applicability, you have a registry of controls that you can go to look at and maybe modify some of those controls. Save money, be smarter, work smarter, basically. Okay, internal control framework for integration with cybersecurity. So now we're going to talk about SOC. So we talk about internal controls for financial reporting on the last page, COSO, ERM. And now we're going to talk about SOC and TCS. So SOC report focus on controls addressing in 5 semi-overlapping categories called trust principles. So we talk about privacy here. Privacy has been kind of set out because it's a very popular topic, and people like to talk about breaches of security, and the first thing they ask about was any private information taken, because of course there's a big penalty for that. There's a possibility of maybe a class action suit. There's a lot of issues around it. But in the ERM world, privacy is a compliance issue. The protection of information, cybersecurity supports the protection of private information. If you have privacy conducting their own information security activities, they're going to overlap a lot. They're going to be doing the same thing. In fact, if you look at the IAPPP framework, it was based on ISO 27001, which is the information security framework. So it's all the same. Same with PCI, was based on ISO 27001. The STAR cloud computing was based on it. A lot of things. ISO 27001, began back in 1995 with the UK government. And the history is that they were having trouble getting their suppliers and vendors to comply with the government's security standards. So they created a new framework in order to get that done, and then they started registering and certifying people against it, and it grew from there. And so eventually, after 1995, by the time I think 2005 rolled around, the International Standards Organization in Switzerland picked it up and adopted it and made it ISO 27001 and a whole series of control frameworks to protect information. And from there, it's been growing. So I think it's growing at about 20% every year now. Definitely more commercially friendly than Nist cybersecurity framework. Okay, let's talk about privacy under the SOC. Access control, multi-factor authentication, and encryption. These are all cybersecurity controls. No problem there. Lots of overlap. Firewall, intrusion detection, multi-factor authentication listed again. So again, these are all part of the infrastructure security framework. Availability, performance monitoring, disaster recovery, and incident handling. The one thing I would say about disaster recovery is, with a lot of my customers anyway, disaster recovery is becoming less and less of an issue as more and more cloud gets adopted. And the reason for that, I think it's kind of obvious, is that if you have your enterprise resource system operating in the cloud, and you have all your business tools operating in the cloud, you can lose a facility and still regain your operations in another part of the world. You can have another team pick it up and take it over. So disaster recovery is not so much of an issue as it used to be. Now it's more service continuity, to be honest with you, and about making sure your service is continuously running, making sure you're testing your failovers and that type of stuff. Incident handling obviously is important. These things are covered, well, at least disaster and incident are covered in Nist. Performance monitoring, it needs to be added. So that's one thing that they missed under identify. It's not listed there. Certainly when I implement the Nist cybersecurity framework, I include it as part of the regular operations, the business reporting, the annual tactical plan. We need to have key performance indicators. We also need to have other types of reporting on the efficiency and effectiveness of our defense in depth. We need to have some quality assurance activities going on, process monitoring. So processing integrity. This is built in. Again, this is under Protect within the Nist cybersecurity framework. We have integrity checking for infrastructure devices. So they can automatically detect the integrity of the device that they're sending to upstream or downstream. And then we have another layer that looks at the integrity of the information. So we have people involved in some of that process, but we can also automate that process a bit because we can have field level checking, and we can do exception reporting when we do a large maintenance update and to a database. We can have an exception report generated before it gets added to the database in order to make sure that it's 100%. There's no anomalies or things that need to be fixed. This is really going to be really more important in the future as we get into quantum computing, because we have data lakes and we're populating data lakes with information that's coming from the business. So we have a team of business intelligence people gathering data from the business, and then they're massaging it. Same with data scientists, massaging that and putting it into the data lake. And we need to have more quality assurance around that process. So this is an evolutionary step. Again, it is addressed in the Nist cybersecurity framework, but it needs to be called out more, I think. Process monitoring, again, looking, for failed processes. So I think we've been doing that for a long time. It may change now with the cloud, because we need to have people monitoring the cloud activities, not so much the on-premise equipment. Confidentiality, we talk about encryption, access controls, and firewalls again. So we're talking about infrastructure controls. So again, no problem there. That's all covered under Nist. That's part of the cybersecurity process. Now, if we look under SAP, the way that we did it there, so I led a project for a very good company in Washington, D.C., VirtuStream, and they're actually classified as a unicorn. So they're so special. Within a 5-year span, I think they sold twice while I was there, once to EMC and then once to Dell. And I think the first purchase was like 1.1 million, and then the next purchase was like 27 billion or something like that. But so what does VirtuStream do? They're a U.S. federal cloud service provider. They run SAP HANA HEC. And if you haven't heard about HANA HEC, this is the SAP way of dealing with cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities. And they've done a pretty good job on it, I must say. So their controls go down to the microchip level of processing. So they're very into the data. Their databases are normalized relational databases. So they have a lot of data spread around, and so they need to focus more on the processing and handling of the information between the database and the customers and the offices. But in order to achieve SAP HANA HEC, what my job was to come in and lead the adoption and certification of ISO 27001, 9001, and 22301. And this was a bit of a different environment for them because 27001 I'm very familiar with, and I'm familiar with all of these, but 9001 has traditionally always been the parent in the relationship of all ISO standards. In this case, it was the child, and the parent was the 27001 standard. So this was a big change. And then, of course, the 22301. So ISO, if you're not familiar with these, so 27001 is all about information security or cybersecurity. 9001 is about quality management. And 27001, when the ISO organization adopted it in 2005, they harmonized it with quality management. So a lot of the overlaps, you can see a lot of things are grayed out here. And then 22301 is business continuity. Okay, so I created this, is called a crosswalk, and then it went down the list of controls, and this is something that you could do with the ISO standard or the NIST standard, and you could compare it to the internal control framework or the COSO ERM or the SOC requirements, and you could eliminate a lot of duplication between the control frameworks. But the most important thing that you're going to end up with, which none of those other frameworks have, is you're going to have a management system. And the management system is listed in clauses 4 down to clause 10. And the management system includes the governance that we talked about earlier, the risk management process. There's 7 steps actually, or 7 processes. So there's governance, risk management, continual improvement, awareness training, strategic communications, internal audit and document and records management to gather evidence and to make sure that we always have real-time evidence in that type of environment, because cybersecurity is all about real-time. There's no tomorrow or yesterday. It's now, and everything has to be ready now and available now. And if there's a problem, we have to fix it now. So there's no time to tinker around. So the crosswalk is a very useful exercise to go through. We're going to talk about how to integrate the control frameworks and map the controls. So we have a product or service here, and what I've done is I've used this type of fishbone diagram here, and I've identified the physical assets, so the people, information, and facilities, and then the technical ones, software, hardware, and telecom. And then I've gone through the process of actually mapping the controls. So when I've done my risk assessment, I've looked at my vulnerabilities to the assets. I've looked at the impacts. I've looked at the existing controls, and I've looked at the exposure to any potential threats. I've come up with a list. When I look at the existing controls, I come up with a list of controls. If they're not already here in the statement of applicability, I make recommendations on them based on multiple frameworks, multiple good controls on how to mitigate risk. And these are mapped to each of the assets. So you can see here, this is Annex A mapped to these assets. And you can see the weighting. So right here, you can see that the people controls are a little light, as well as the facilities, and to a lesser extent the telecom. But information, hardware, and software are definitely have a number of controls around them to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and availability of this information. And this is what I mean about GDPR and FOIPA and a lot of the privacy legislations. If you integrate those and you map them, so you list them in the legal registry as a requirement under regulations or under statutes, and you map those into the framework of controls on the statement of applicability, then you can integrate all of these processes into a seamless program that will manage all the risks around those issues. It works very well. Now, in the reverse, what this also does is it allows us to pinpoint where there may be control deficiencies. So if we see a number of controls in here for information, but we've had an information issue, integrity issue, we might go back and review these. These are all listed again in the statement of applicability. We might say, why isn't that control? Maybe it wasn't configured properly, right? Maybe it wasn't implemented. Maybe it hasn't been tested regularly. There's something about that control in here that we want to look at before we decide to implement a new control, because adding new controls should definitely be scrutinized quite a bit. The other thing that we can do too is we can take the list of controls and we can calculate a cyber risk rating for whatever the product or services you're delivering. So if you're a large enterprise and you have multiple services or products that you're delivering and you're wondering what is the exposure of that to cyber risks, we can actually calculate it and give you a rating so that you know that if you're making X number of dollars revenue and you want to invest a little bit of money to protect that asset a little bit more, that you have that intelligence that's been provided by the cybersecurity team to make that decision with. Okay, so this is a really good process, something that I've created. Again, back to the relationship between financial risk, hazard risk, strategic compliance, and operational risk. So we've talked about this several times. I've tried to touch on it as we've gone through the process. All of these things have implications. Obviously, cybersecurity has traditionally been associated with operational risk, but compliance risk is also an issue because we have information regulations such as GDPR, FOIPA, and what have you. So cybersecurity can help mitigate risks around these two areas. It can also mitigate risks around hazard risks. So for instance, we use CCTV, we have visitor lists, we do access control, we can manage who comes into our building, we can see what's going on in our building, and we can protect people. We also have disaster recovery plans and business continuity plans, and we can do succession planning. We can work with HR on that to make sure that we know who the key people are that need to be protected the most. So they might have added layers of control. For instance, if you have an executive or executive team visiting a foreign country, you may have a security detail sit with them and walk them around and drive them around and make sure that they're safe. That can happen. As for financial risk and strategic risk, well, a lot of the big cybersecurity incidents that are having impacts on organization. One of the early ones, don't know if you remember this, but was ChoicePoint. ChoicePoint was one of the big breaches. I think it was like 9 million or something like that. It was a big problem. Well, unfortunately, ChoicePoint got hammered, right? So eventually ChoicePoint did sell, but it sold for like, I think 11 or 15% under its market value because the reputational damage that was caused by the breach was so devastating. So when you talk about financial risks, then there's the unplanned costs associated with things like ransomware and also breaches, other types of breaches, personal information. So it has an impact. Cybersecurity can have an impact on that area, but also strategic risk. So if your plan is, uptake of a certain market area, market segment, you have strategic plans, or you suffer some kind of a serious breach that might stop you from going forward, right? It can have an impact on strategic plannings. So this goes, again, way beyond internal controls for financial reporting. But it's based on the same control framework. It just extends it out farther. The relationship between operational risk. Again, this is just a quick summary table here. So operational risk is associated with human error, accidents, or malicious threats. Compliance is associated with executive. Executives have fiduciary responsibilities. They have to follow the law, and cybersecurity can make sure that that is done from the information handling perspective. Hazard risk, exposure to non-human threats, acts of nature. Mentioned the DR or the DRP plan can help people. We can also have employee safety programs, and we monitor, with closed circuit television and also access control. We limit access to certain areas that have types of exposure that could hurt employees. So we prevent that. Financial risk, a breach can lead to insolvency, right? Some organizations can go Chapter 11. And we talked about the magnitude of the breach and the mom and pop shops that can't potentially survive. There's other organizations too. Let's look at the Equifax breach. 147 million records of Americans and other nationalities. And so far they spent $750 million to repair that. And the CEO did get fired for that. So did the CISO on that job, on that breach. But $750 million, how many companies do you know that could just reach into their treasury and pull out $750 million and say, here, without the shareholders wanting some blood? It could be a big problem. So financial risk is something that definitely that cybersecurity can help prevent any sort of unplanned expenses like that. Strategic risk, again, missed financial goals, unrealized business benefits because of a breach or a reputational damage caused by a breach. Cybersecurity can help with that as well. Now, we're getting to the end here. So there are some types of risks that can't be fully mitigated, and those types of risks go into something called a risk registry. And the risk registry is sort of a predefined plan by the enterprise, by the governance committee, on what they're going to do if a risk is about to occur. Okay, so for instance, let's look at processing risk. So the Federal Information Security Act, FISMA, requires us in the U.S. to apply certain controls, Nist controls like the 853-4 or the Nist Cybersecurity Framework, right? So as long as we're complying with that, then we're good, okay? So if we have a problem where we're not complying with that anymore, we have to take some action. In the risk registry, what we can do is we can have trigger points. So each of these colors will have a trigger point and some plans based on it behind. So some action plans, and they're all predefined and agreed to by the executives, so we can take action on them right away. The same with other compliance issues like GLBA or GDPR or FOIPA or what have you. Operational risks, we can talk about mobile code as a risk or insider. These are things that we can't totally eliminate. They could go on for forever, but we might have some trigger points. So we might have to say, okay, if there's been some incidents, but no one has taken any data, then we're okay because we're controlling that situation. If we have malicious code hitting our firewalls, being filtered by antivirus or endpoint security protection, then we're good there, or IPS maybe is picking it up. However, if we don't, then what do we do? So if we go to yellow, are there any sort of issues that we should do? Issues that we need to address with maybe a predefined action plan, and so on and so forth. So that's the way that the risk registry is supposed to work within an organization. And again, so I listed only two here: compliance risk and operational risk from the ERM. There's three other categories that you would list here. So there would be financial risk, hazard risk, and strategic risk as well. And then you could define the type of activities that could be causing concern and define trigger points for how to address with those. So this is a really proactive kind of approach. That's what this is intended for. Risk Registry is intended to deal with risks that don't go away. The risk treatment plan is different. And unfortunately, we're not talking about that today, but it is part of the risk management methodology. The risk treatment plan is more of a monitoring dashboard that the governance committee would keep track of, that the CISO would manage on a day-to-day basis to make sure that those activities are being addressed and risks are being mitigated. And again, the trigger points can be defined here. What is our goal? What's the trigger for each of these issues? And let's document it. Okay, and that's it for my presentation. Again, I want to thank InfoNext for inviting me in to speak at the conference. Our audio on the day wasn't recorded very well, so I wanted to redo this for them to make sure that all the members and participants had access to this information and they can review it. If you have additional questions, you can always reach me at the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity Excellence. This is our website, and this is our general email. So please drop us a line, and good luck with your internal controls over financial reporting and your cybersecurity plans for the future. Thanks for now. I'm Mark Bernard, and I'm signing off.